Hey there, ho there, and hi there. This is going to be a follow up to my prior video talking about graduate school applications and how to make the best case for yourself when you're applying to PhD programs. But this time we are going to talk about what it looks like on the other side of that process. What happens after you followed my advice and you have dozens of offers from all the top programs, and you have to ultimately make a decision about whether or not you actually want to go to any of them? Is a PhD the right choice for you, and what is your life going to actually look like as a graduate student? Sometimes it's hard to get concrete answers to those questions, so I'm going to do my best here to give you an honest account as somebody that has gone through the program, talk about the good, the bad, and the sometimes very ugly about the process of pursuing a PhD. So, at the jump to get things started, I want to lead with an anecdote, and there's a movie that happened a long time ago, and there's a character in there that talks about how life is like a box of chocolates. Graduate school is nothing like that. It's a lot more like Winnie the Pooh Home Run Derby, actually. You know, that great Flash game that all the cool influencers play? As you go through that game, generally the rules stay the same. It's a lot like going through education. You go from kindergarten to grade school to middle school, high school, and so on and so forth. And the rules change very little between them. Maybe there's more work, maybe you get a curveball every now and then, but the game is fundamentally the same. And you think to yourself that you're doing so good at school, you might as well go get your PhD, right? That's the natural thing to do. So you apply to a bunch of programs, maybe you accept an offer at one of them, and on your first day, this guy is waiting for you at the door, and everything changes. The world is upside down, the ball is invisible, and you have no idea if you ever actually understood the rules of baseball anymore. When you get into a PhD program, the rules change. From the start to the, well, basically late phases of a master's program in terms of your education, you are expected to primarily be a consumer of knowledge. Just think about all the tests and all the papers that you've written over the course of your career as a student. They're not really about making anything new. They're more about showing that you were able to take the important parts of whatever you were taught and then prove that you understood them, either by getting questions correctly or putting them in your own words. And that's all well and good. But when you go into a PhD program, the game changes substantially, and you are now expected to be a producer of knowledge first and foremost. It's no longer about just knowing the important parts. You're expected to know your field of expertise inside and out. And not just to be a big old smarty pants and show off to people, but so that you can identify where there are gaps in knowledge and then ask those questions and contribute to understanding by getting information and acquiring knowledge that nobody else has done before you. Let's just close your eyes. Let's do a little bit of a visualization. Imagine that you are late into your PhD. Everybody else has gone home for the night, and you are the last person in the lab. You've been frustrated all day, and you're maybe nursing your sixth cup of coffee. But just as you're about to go home, a light bulb goes on in your head, and you think to run that analysis one more time, but you're going to tweak something. And then you run it, you sit, you twiddle your thumbs, and lo and behold, it works out. In that moment, you realize that alone in that building, alone in your lab, you are the first person to know the answer to whatever question you just asked. And if that sounds appealing to you, you might be a good fit for a PhD program. But even if you are suited to this kind of work and it sounds exciting to you, that doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. I was very successful in my program, but I actually had a very hard time adjusting to life in higher education. In some ways, it was the best job I've ever had. In other ways, it was a miserable experience that I am still recovering from. I always thought that people were joking when they said that it takes 7 years to recover from a PhD, but let's just say that after a few years, I'm starting to think that they might have had a point. Because this job is hard, physically, emotionally, and mentally. And I want to use this video to maybe get a couple of things out of the way and to get you as a maybe new student or prospective student to be thinking about some stuff ahead of the curve so that maybe you'll have an easier time than I did. And the first topic that I want to get into is time management. Now, this might seem rudimentary, but it's very important in a PhD program to really be thinking about this stuff because you have a tremendous degree of freedom to explore. It's going to vary a little bit depending on the nuances of your program. I happen to have a very laissez faire advisor, and as long as I could make a case for why I was interested in whatever I wanted to look at, generally she would sign the paperwork and I was free to dive into whatever rabbit hole I was looking into. And that was really cool. I was able to develop real expertise. I was able to learn the inside and out of whatever question I was interested in, really get a good feel for the literature, not only in that one little subdomain, but also to see how all of these different pieces fit together and form my field of social psychology. And that's awesome. I haven't really had the freedom to do that before or since. And on top of that, I wasn't just free in terms of what content I wanted to look at, I was also able to make up my own schedule. I was generally a 9 to 5er, but I had students and new people that wanted to go on and let's say they realized that they were much better working at night. And so that's what they did. Or they wanted to get started as soon as they woke up and maybe they were in the office as early as 4 or 5 in the morning. You really have a tremendous degree of control over what you're going to do in constructing your own curriculum as a PhD student. And that rules pretty hard. Prior to starting as a PhD student, I worked in a traditional office with a boss that really did not want to pay overtime. And so when the clock hit 5 o'clock, we would basically get kicked out. And that just doesn't apply in graduate school. I had control over that, and that is kind of a mixed bag, actually. Without someone to monitor your schedule and keep you on track, it's very easy to fall into working very long hours as a graduate student. There's no one to tell you when to take breaks or when to start or when to stop, and so it's not uncommon to work 50, 60, 70, or even 80 or more hours in a week at the PhD level. That might sound extreme, but there's a lot of informal and formal pressures that keep people in the lab longer than maybe they intend to. For starters, there is always more that you can do in this job. There's always another analysis or another study, or maybe you could submit another IRB proposal. The work never really ends unless you want it to. And on top of that, it's extremely competitive. At the end of the day, there are only so many slots for posters and publications. There are only so many grant award winners. And once you get out of the actual ivory tower and you're on the job market, you really are competing with everybody else in your cohort for a limited number of jobs. There are always more people graduating in a given year than there are professorship positions open. And while it's better if you're looking for industry or anywhere outside of academia, it's still very competitive. And so there is a lot of pressure to always be working to make sure that you are as prepared as possible for the job market after you graduate. In fact, when I first started, even before I started at my orientation, the head of our research area gave a spiel about a story or a time, a night. Maybe it never happened, maybe it did. But he was sitting in his lab and he was thinking about going home, and then he stopped and he thought about another student at another university that he was going to be competing with on the job market. And that person was staying to work maybe another hour or two. They're going to read one more paper. They were going to run another analysis. And then thinking about that person, my professor decided to sit down and he was going to stay for 2 more hours, just to be a little bit more prepared than that person. And let's be real. Let's break that down for a second. The environment in academia is so competitive at times that you have to make up people to compete with if there's nobody else around you to directly compare yourself to. That's sort of the environment that you're in. It is the water you swim in some PhD programs, and it's a thing that I highly encourage you to argue against because I think it's actually maybe the worst thing about the job and definitely drives some people who work extremely long hours when they don't really need to. There's also I guess what my advisor would call a cult of productivity in academia. And this is more of an informal cultural thing. Yeah, you've got the formal reality that you want to make your Vita as competitive as possible. But everyone also wants to look like they are the most productive person in the department. And so you've got people that maybe are productive for only 4 hours of the day, but stay in the office for 14 so that they can get a high score in academia, as if that's a thing that is possible to achieve and reasonable to want. It's a thing you just got to be thinking about here, that there's a lot of pressure, whether it's formal or informal, to work really long hours. And having good time management skills is a very important way of making sure that you have anything resembling work life balance in a PhD program. Because this job is going to fill the time that you have. And being able to make sure that you have hobbies or other interests is very important to make sure that work does not become your life. I was very lucky during my orientation that after that spiel, another professor talked to me and said, "Hey, make sure that you have a hobby. I don't care what it is, but have something that is not work, or else this job will become your life and you will hate it." And honestly, maybe the best piece of advice that I got throughout my tenure. It happened in my first week of grad school, and it was downhill from there. It's actually a lot like content now that I think about it. There's always something more you can do, another video, another post, or something like that. And look, I may not be the greatest creator in the world, but I've followed enough people over the years and seen enough creators burn out to understand those parallels. And it seems like among bigger content creators, as well as some of the more successful graduate students I've known, having good time management and especially being able to have boundaries to keep your work contained is very important for making sure that you are going to be successful in the long term. Now, if that wasn't enough of a bummer, and if I haven't scared you away enough that you haven't turned the video off, let's move on to something even worse. We're going to talk about money for a second. When I was in grad school, I got into a certain habit of going and getting the sandwich that was formerly known as the $5 footlong and eating half for lunch and half for dinner. Because let's be real, graduate school does not pay well. Most programs are not rolling in cash, and when they do find money, it's typically not going to graduate students. I, at the high end, was probably making about $1,500 a year, $15,000, add a zero to that, thank God. Which sounds like enough money. You can live on it. And as a graduate student, typically you're going to get some kind of stipend to live off of and a tuition remission. So, in a way, you're getting paid to go to school. And that's cool. That's great. But it's not a lot. And it starts to wear at you as time goes on. As things went on in my program and I got to my third, my fourth, my fifth year, my friends back home started graduating from law school and medical school. They started buying houses and having families. And I was sitting here in the lab at 9 o'clock at night, eating the other half of a cold sandwich and feeling like I was still kind of a teenager. In some ways, grad school can feel like a suspended adolescence. You miss some of the markers of adulthood while your friends are achieving them because they're getting the quote unquote real jobs and quote unquote adult money. And then you, as a graduate student, are maybe arcing into your late 20s or your early 30s, and you're only just now getting your career started. And if you want to go on the academic route, it's becoming more and more common to have multiple postdocs in addition to your graduate work. So, if you want to be a professor, you might not be getting your first quote unquote real job until you're maybe in your early to mid 30s. And that's a thing to consider. No, it doesn't really bug you at the start. At least it didn't bug me at the start of my program. But as I started getting closer to graduation, I started to feel more like a teenager and less like an adult, even though my skills and competence were increasing, but my actual sort of happiness and satisfaction with being a student was going down. Again, a thing to just be thinking about on the front end because this will creep up on you and it will make you miserable if you let it. But despite all of that, this job whips. It is excellent. It is probably the best job I've ever had in a lot of ways. And if you are the kind of person like me that enjoys this kind of work, if you want to just spend hours reading and researching and learning everything there is to know about the stuff you care about, you're never going to have a better job than when you're getting your PhD. The work is incredibly fulfilling, and you might find satisfaction in ways that you didn't even expect. I didn't think teaching was going to work out for me. I thought I was going to just be a professor and a full time academic or researcher. And then I got into the classroom. And when you get into into a groove and you click with your students and you're bantering back and forth, maybe people are ribbing you maybe you've got some good give and take with your students. It's fun. It's so much fun. And the satisfaction you get when a student shows up in your office hours and they're struggling with some material and you give them a metaphor or some kind of analogy and it clicks with them and you can just see it. And so all of a sudden they understand this concept. I don't know how to describe it. It's excellent and I miss it a lot. If instructors were paid better, I probably would have become a full time teacher. But even outside of that, no matter what route you choose to go, you are picking up skills along the way that are highly valuable after you graduate. While you're getting your PhD, it becomes very normal to spend every day around people that are also doing the same thing. They're getting their doctorates or they are professors. That just is the water that you swim in. And so you stop really even thinking about it after a while. But then you graduate and you go ahead and you get a real job, quote unquote, real job. And then you realize that all of a sudden, people look at you like you know what you're talking about. And all of a sudden, you're an expert. And things that you thought were very common and skills that you thought were easy are not that common and are not that easy. If you've gone and you've watched my lectures on stuff like statistics and methods, just watching that, you're actually pretty far ahead of the game of most people. If you can even do an ANOVA or an analysis of variance, heck, if you even knew what that acronym stood for, you're actually in a pretty good position as far as the job market goes. And once you have that accreditation of the PhD at the end of your name, you might even be able to land a six-figure job where you aren't really doing anything more complicated than an ANOVA, but your opinions and your expertise are so valuable that you're going to have a lot of sway and a lot of control over your scheduling, and you're going to feel like a rock star because honestly, you are. You know a lot of stuff. You are an expert, and you're going to feel like it, even if you didn't necessarily notice it while you were getting your degree. Okay, let's move on though to something else here. Wrapping this up, this is the last subject I want to touch on this point. The most important thing to consider through all of this when you're thinking about your life as a graduate student or what you want to really be getting out of this process, and if this is even going to be a good fit for you to begin with, is that happy students are productive students. If you are going to be miserable, and just sort of putting your nose to the grind for 5, 6, 7 years to get your degree, to try to get a job that you think you want, it's probably not worth it. I've seen a number of people and I've heard more stories about students that accept a position at a university that is, let's say, prestigious or with a professor that has a strong reputation, but they don't actually like the work. And so they tell themselves that they're just going to deal with it for X number of years. But at the end of it, they've just been miserable. They haven't been productive. And then they go on the job market and they land a pretty mid position and start wondering if any of the time that they spent as a PhD student was actually worth anything. And it's a sad story, and I don't want that for any of you. So think about this. Really think about what your life is going to be like outside of your work. Because life as a graduate student doesn't just constitute your life in the lab. When you are interviewing, when you are talking to other students, ask them, are they happy in the town that they're living in? Are they bored of it? And do they actually get along with the other students? Do they hang out? What is the climate? What's the vibe? What kind of hobbies do they have? Because if you're just moving to a very small college town and you're going to have to give up your hobbies, maybe you're really into skiing and you're moving somewhere in the South that doesn't actually let you do that, think about whether or not you're still going to be happy. Because if you're not, it is going to come out in your work. One of the big deciding factors between my offers was exactly this question. I was on my interview night and at the program that I actually ended up accepting an offer at. And we were just kind of hanging out. I was being hosted by 3 students that were renting a house together and they were in the process of moving out. And we were eating microwave pizza rolls and drinking beers out on their porch when one of the other students comes out with one of those cheap kind of cheap wood, kind of basically cardboard IKEA chairs, shatters it on their patio, tosses it into the fire pit, and sets the whole thing alight. And then we had a bonfire. And probably shouldn't have been inhaling those fumes, but let's not worry about that too much. But really, in that moment, I realized that these students were not bullshitting me. They genuinely liked being here and they liked being around each other. They were comfortable both at work, but also outside of that. They would hang out. They would go to the coast and rent boats and hang out and do whatever, go fishing. That was a really healthy environment to be in. And all of them were also extremely productive. So I think there might be something to this correlation between being happy in your program and actually being productive. They worked hard, they played hard, and that environment really helped me stay grounded and feel supported in my own program, and ultimately probably played a big role in my success as a doctor and my ongoing success in my career afterwards. At the end of the day, I really want to stress this. Getting a PhD is hard. It's really, really hard. Again, emotionally, physically, and definitely mentally. And because of that, it's not for everyone. And if you're listening to any of this and you're thinking, I don't know if that's for me, or I don't know if I'm going to be happy doing all this work. I don't know if I want to work 80 hours a week for basically sub minimum wage and be reading journal articles for 12 hours a day. Well, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. This is not for everybody. Getting a PhD is not just the natural step where you're like, well, I was really good at grade school, might as well go to middle school, might as well go to high school. The rules change. It's a completely different deal. And instead of being a student, it's probably healthier to think about this as a job, and especially setting you up for a career. And if you don't like the work leading into that career, odds are you're not going to like the career that you end up with. So I really want to stress that if you don't think you're going to be happy in whatever graduate school program you're looking at, don't accept it. It's not worth it. You might think that, I'll get a job afterwards and I'll be set and I'll have the PhD after my name. Look, it's just my opinion, but I don't think it's worth being miserable for X number of years so that you can maybe get a position that might make you happy. More often than not, you're not going to like the position either, and it's going to feel like a waste of time. But getting ahead of this and thinking about these things now, either as you are maybe being a prospective student or getting started with graduate school, is an important step for avoiding burnout, because if you aren't proactive about some of these points and making sure that you're taking care of yourself and checking in with yourself, you're going to burn out. And it's very easy to not realize it until you're already there. Trust me, that was me in grad school around my second year. I was working crazy hours, and then I got a series of rejections on grants and papers. And in that moment, the brakes screeched to a halt, and I realized how burnt out I actually was. Checked in with myself, learned a lot of the lessons that I've talked about in this little presentation, short as it is, and ultimately walked away being much happier for it. But hopefully, you're not going to have to go through that burnout, because you can think about these things and check in with yourself and make sure you're keeping your head above water. Because it is important ultimately to center your own happiness in all of this. When you're thinking about your life as a graduate student, I honestly think this is the most important thing. More so than publications, more so than the job market, more so than anything else. Make sure that you are happy. Because if you are happy, you're going to be productive. And that's ultimately probably even less important than being happy to begin with. So that's what I've got for this one. This is a little bit off the cuff, but I hope it was helpful. If you have any questions or comments or troubles of concern, try to let me know in the comment section. I'll do my best to check in basically throughout, as long as this channel is up, to try to respond to people. I think that this whole series, both between the lectures and checking in with this stuff, is very important. And I like to be a resource to prospective students whenever I can be and however I can be. So yeah, just let me know and I'll try to get back to you. But beyond that, I hope you're doing well. And more importantly, whether or not you want to be a doctor or not, be nice to yourself. And it seems like that's becoming the sign off for everything I do lately, but it's a good note to end on. So yeah, do that. Be nice to yourself and take care. Bye.